Hey everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the Vietnam War. In many ways, this could be looked at as a failure of American policy in the Cold War. This was the most significant of the proxy conflicts fought by the United States against the communist regime, fought to contain communist expansion. Um, and it left deep stains, deep scars on the United States psyche and on how the United States fights wars. So as we saw in Korea, the Vietnam War was essentially a civil war between a northern country, which was communist, and a southern country, which was democratic capitalist. So Vietnam had been a French colonial asset. When the French had pulled out and left it, the country essentially went to war between communist and capitalist. And so the communist Vietnam threatened the U.S. ally South Vietnam in the 1950s and 1960s. So why does this matter? Look at the map there. Look at where Vietnam is compared to where the United States is. Vietnam is a relatively small country in Southeast Asia. It's mainly jungle. And the nation had really no value to the United States. Again, it's a small country on the other side of the world. So why does this matter? Why does the United States get involved in a war? So we have to remember the idea of containment, or the idea of a domino theory. The United States, in the idea of containing communists, believed that every nation was vital to the United States, that every nation that fell to a communist regime was an existential threat to the United States. The idea of a domino theory, like dominoes, if one country fell, the rest of the world would tumble. So the US pursued a policy of containment. You can see that depiction here in the domino theory, the idea of Vietnam being pushed over by the Viet Cong by communist forces, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh. What's next? So remember, the idea is the United States wants to stand up to the expansion of communism. So to prevent a communist overrunning of Korea, the United States joins in helping South Korea fight a civil war. So the United States joins the Vietnam War in 1963 when President Kennedy sent troops, about 16,000 troops, to help South Vietnam defend itself. These troops were sent in the roles of advisors. They were there to help out the South Vietnamese army, to help them prepare their defenses and to defend against communist aggression. But American troops are now in Vietnam. However, the presence of American troops did not end the conflict. The communists actually stepped up their attacks. The communists did not back down in the presence of Americans and South Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese army and communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong in South Vietnam stepped up their attacks to try to topple the South Vietnamese government. So the nature of the war changes in 1964. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is passed by Congress. What happens in the Gulf of Tonkin? The Gulf of Tonkin is off of North Vietnam. There are American Navy ships positioned there, and these ships claim that North Vietnamese forces fired torpedoes at them during a storm. We're not sure if this actually ever happened, but what it does is it rallies the American Congress, rallies the President of the United States to declare war on North Vietnam. And so much like the idea of the Pearl Harbor attacks, this is kind of the match that gets the whole thing going. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is passed by Congress. This gives President Lyndon Johnson the power to send forces to Vietnam. So President Lyndon Johnson assumed that the enemy would crumble under the might of the U.S. military. Remember, the U.S. military is the most powerful force in the world. So the idea of sending troops over there, sending the power of the American military, this would be an easy conflict to win. So he sent in 530,000 troops. However, with all their power, the U.S. policy was flawed when it went to Vietnam. The United States committed itself to fight a limited war in Vietnam. That is, the idea was they were just going to defend the ally in South Vietnam from North Vietnam, but the goal was to contain communism, not to destroy North Vietnam. So the idea is they're not going to invade the North, they're just going to defend the South from communist aggression. The main policy of the United States was kill the enemy until they surrendered. So there wasn't any tactical or strategic goals other than just to resist attacks. And the United States figured if they killed enough North Vietnamese army members and Viet Cong that they would eventually retreat, they would eventually surrender. But this policy is flawed. So this is a bad situation. America could only defend the ally, South Vietnam. So you see South Vietnam, this is where the American forces are held, and they're basically stopping the aggression of North Vietnam. They cannot attack the enemy in North Vietnam. So they again, all they're trying to do is kill North Vietnamese army members, Viet Cong members trying to come in so that they will eventually say it's not worth it and retreat back to North Vietnam. The reason that the United States thought that they would be able to win this conflict easily is that they had overwhelming military superiority. Um, the United States, the generals, and those planning the war assumed that U.S. firepower would destroy enemies' resolve. They believed that the amount of weaponry, the amount of technology, the airplanes, the helicopters, the bombs they had, that this would be an easy war against an easy opponent. They were fighting a poor guerrilla force and a under the North Vietnamese army that did not have the firepower of the United States. One of the huge aspects of American power was the introduction of the helicopter into combat. The Vietnam War is actually the first large helicopter conflict. So what the helicopter allows them to do is get into areas in the jungle easily, land, um, get troops in and out easily. And this is what really helps the United States throughout the war. And this is what kind of gives them a false sense of superiority too. They're able to overtake areas, but they're also able to pull their wounded out. But this is the first major helicopter conflict. You can see that the amount of firepower, the amount of weaponry the United States has in this war. The United States also has a powerful Navy, a powerful Air Force, and that is able to launch bombing raids and bomb the enemy from above. So they have the capability to try to destroy Vietnam, the North Vietnamese forces, the aggression of North Vietnam from above. During the Vietnam War, particularly from 1975 through 1973, the United States dropped more bombs than they had during the entirety of World War II. So remember the massive firebombings of Japan, the bombings in Europe. The United States uses more firepower in fighting the Vietnam War than they did in World War II. Again, this firepower allowed the United States to think that they could simply use their capabilities to crush the Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. They believed that they could bomb them out of the war, that they could just essentially kill enough people that they would give up. But this false sense of superiority proved a disaster in the war. The United States also used new technologies to try to fight guerrilla forces, fight forces in Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam is a jungle country. It is very easy for forces to move around under the jungle canopy. And so what the United States uses is what's known as Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a defoliant. Basically what that means is that it causes the leaves of trees and plants to die. So that way, when the forces are in the air, remember the United States has the air superiority, they are able to see the force move around because the jungle is dead. You can see what Agent Orange does here to the jungle. It kills all the plants, everything around it. So you can see forces moving around. But what happens also is Agent Orange was proven later to cause cancer. So the United States is dropping cancerous chemicals on Vietnam. In fighting jungle warfare, the United States also used a massive amount of napalm. Napalm is basically a giant firebomb, and what it is, it's basically a sticky substance, explodes and sticks to everything. So this is how they fought in the jungles. They would drop napalm on areas where they thought the enemy forces were, but of course this is indiscriminate bombing. So the United States did have a huge advantage in the amount of power, in the overwhelming military superiority they had. They had B-52 bombers, nuclear weapons, tanks, helicopters, etc. But they were fighting against homemade weapons and a largely untrained guerrilla force. The US won every battle it faced in Vietnam. This is what the United States faced. Remember, they've got B-52s, Agent Orange, napalm, bombs. But what they're facing is they're fighting in a foreign country against people who are fighting for the homeland. And what they were up against is a largely untrained force of guerrilla fighters. So you see a woman here with an American M16 rifle. You also see a booby trap. The country was booby trapped throughout. There were tunnels throughout where the Viet Cong could move around unseen. And so the United States is really fighting on foreign territory. If we remember what happened in the Revolutionary War, this is kind of a similar situation. So this is a dedicated enemy. Again, remember the Revolutionary War. Remember the Americans fighting against the British, fighting on their home turf, fighting for what they saw as freedom. You can look at the Vietnamese conflict like that. These are Viet Cong guerrillas are fighting for what they think is their freedom. They're fighting in their backyard. So the communists never gave up, despite the United States policy of trying to kill as many Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars as they could. The war dragged on for years since the U.S. could not invade North Vietnam. So as the communist forces fail to surrender, this becomes an unpopular war with the American public as this war drags on. Remember, they thought it was going to be easy. They thought Americans would come in and easily crush the willpower of the North Vietnamese forces. However, U.S. casualties are mounting. 58,000 Americans will die by the end of the conflict. And Americans are also shocked by the brutality of the war. Unlike World War II, where the United States is controlling more of the propaganda, controlling more of the footage coming in from the war, here we have nightly news broadcasts from Vietnam. We have pictures being sent daily from Vietnam. We have journalists on the front lines seeing what's actually happened in the conflicts. The American public is seeing pictures, seeing images like you see here of American soldiers wounded, suffering in the jungle, and the war becomes unpopular because of this. Again, you have these images coming home to the United States from Vietnam. And what people are seeing is that much of the war is fought in jungle and in villages. This is areas where people live. This is a civil war. This is a conflict fought in areas where people are extremely poor and being fought in villages. So you have images of these coming back to the United States, and this is really changing people's opinions. So you see here, American soldier carrying a young Vietnamese boy without pants. So the idea is like the horror of this war is present. So while civilians always suffer in war, again, these images coming from Vietnam, the fact that there are news broadcasters on the front lines, that there are journalists on the front lines sending pictures back to the United States, really sets in kind of the horror of this war for the American public. And you can see that here, this depiction of this family being terrified, holding children. If you look at this picture here, it's hard not to feel some sympathy for the Vietnamese people. They're stuck in a conflict. You can see the fear on these people's face. They were basically in a watery trench, hiding from enemy forces, hiding from bombings. And so these images are coming back to the American public and really affecting how people look at the war. One of the hardest things to ever accept in any conflict anywhere in the world is the idea that children can suffer because of it. We like to think about war as man versus man, or good guys versus bad guys. But the idea here is like children are caught in the middle of this conflict. The United States is dropping bombs on areas that are wounding children. They're invading villages, taking over villages where children live. The Vietnamese forces are doing the same. And so what happens is you have pictures like this of children missing arms in wheelchairs. The images coming out of this conflict are shocking. They are disturbing. People are seeing what is happening. Here you have a depiction of a Buddhist monk in South Vietnam lighting himself on fire to protest the war. This is another famous and shocking picture that comes out of the journalism of the Vietnam War. This is a South Vietnamese army officer executing a Viet Cong guerrilla in the streets of Saigon. This is taken right as the bullet enters his head and is going out his head. This is the moment that he's dying. These images are being seen by the American public, being seen throughout the war. And so again, the idea is like the horror of this war is really coming home. So America really begins to turn against the war. Again, these images coming out of the war, the idea that this is not ending quickly. Another thing is the government keeps telling the people, hey, we're going to win this. We're making advances. We are destroying the will of the enemy. And this is really proven wrong with the Tet Offensive in 1968. The Tet Offensive is a major offensive launched by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong against South Vietnamese and American forces. The American forces push it back. They do win this battle, but what it shows is that the will of the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, is not broken, that they are going to continue to fight. And the United States becomes frustrated and divided. The people start saying, hey, we're actually not winning this war. They just launched a massive offensive. College students became especially critical of the war. These are the people who you have to think would get drafted. So protests start happening in the United States. So you have college students protesting like this, basically saying victory for the Viet Cong, defeat imperialism everywhere, basically protesting in support of the enemies of the United States. People are turning against the United States war effort. This is also the generation that the hippies grow out of. So you have the idea of like flower power. So you have the depiction here of a hippie with a flower against people with guns, against the National Guard. So this is really dividing the country. The protest between college students and the national government reach its apex at what happens in Kent State. At Kent State, there would be student protest, and the National Guard was called in. The protesters began throwing things, and the National Guard shoots at the protesters. 4 American college students were killed by the National Guard during these protests. And so this begins to change public opinion even more. So like we oppose the war in Vietnam, but now they're killing American college students on college campuses in the United States. Here's a depiction of one of those students who died. And so the idea is, hey, LBJ, how many kids are you going to kill today? The federal government is going in, the National Guard is trying to stop protest, and it's escalating to the point where American soldiers are killing American civilians. So this is really a breakdown in society, and this kind of mobilizes more people to be like, what is happening? Why is this occurring in the United States? So President Johnson had escalated the war in 1964, but by 1968, the war was so unpopular that President Johnson decided not to run for re-election. He admits that he has failed the American public. He admits that he has gotten in over his head, that the United States has not been able to defeat the Vietnamese, and so he does not run for re-election. So George McGovern runs for the Democratic candidacy in 1968, and Richard Nixon runs for the Republican nomination in 1968 for the presidency. And Nixon really uses Vietnam as his rallying point. Nixon promises that he would end the war, but he doesn't say he's just going to end it immediately. He says that we're going to have a slow withdrawal of U.S. troops and that we will achieve peace with dignity. That is, they will not just pull out, they're not going to admit they've lost, but that they are going to have a slow withdrawal. They're going to help the South Vietnamese maintain their country, but they are going to get out of Vietnam. So Nixon becomes president, and the U.S. military begins what is known as Vietnamization. This is the U.S. equipped and trained South Vietnamese army as Americans withdrew from the conflict. That is, they're basically building up a South Vietnamese army to defend the country once the United States begins to withdraw. So the United States is going to train you, we're going to give you weaponry, but we are eventually going to get out of the conflict. So Nixon is sworn into office in 1969, begins to start moving troops out, but the U.S. troops are in Vietnam for another 4 years. It wasn't until 1973 that the last active U.S. troops leave Vietnam. There are some forces left to kind of help out the South Vietnamese, but the communists continue to advance through those years. And one of the reasons that the communists continue to have success is that the Soviet Union is continuing to give aid and equipment to North Vietnam. So the Soviet Union, again, this is a proxy war. The Soviet Union is aiding North Vietnam while the United States is aiding South Vietnam. So in 1975, South Vietnam falls to communist forces. So the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are able to overrun South Vietnam. And what you see here is people leaving the U.S. Embassy in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. About 7,000 American advisors, American soldiers had been left in the country to help South Vietnam, but once it falls to communist forces, you can see these people trying to get out as quickly as possible. Here's depictions of South Vietnamese citizens trying to get into the American embassy as Saigon falls. You have to remember that these people had aided the Americans, had aided the South Vietnamese government, and now that government has been overthrown. So these people are fearing that they are going to be killed as a result of this. So they're trying to get out of Saigon. Here's a depiction of some of the last boats out of Vietnam from U.S. forces. So we have a boat here loaded with United States service people, but also Vietnamese citizens, South Vietnamese citizens who had aided the United States who are trying to escape because their country has just been defeated. You also have a depiction here of American soldiers pushing off helicopters off boats to make room. Basically, this is an old helicopter. It is damaged, so they're just pushing it off to try to make room for people to get out of South Vietnam. So South Vietnam is defeated. Modern day Vietnam is now a single country. There is no longer a North and South Vietnam. It's just Vietnam. And it is led by a communist government. So the communists in North Vietnam win the Vietnam War and unify the country as a single nation led by a communist government. So as a result of the Vietnam War, there begins to be relaxed relations between the United States and some of the communist governments. So President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger open up relations with the Chinese Communist government in 1963. Nixon goes to Vietnam to meet Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist government, and Nixon and Kissinger used China to leverage Vietnam at the end of the war, basically to create better peace terms between the North and the South to unite the country. Nixon and Kissinger also formally acknowledged the People's Republic of China. They had had no relationship with them from 1949 to 1973. And this begins a system known as détente. Basically what this means is that the Cold War is going to go even colder. The idea here is that both sides will resist trying to expand, and they will try to resist having these proxy wars, having these conflicts. So following Vietnam, Cold War relations begin to soften. The proxy wars, the conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States seem less likely. Nixon worked at improving relations with the Soviet Union. Here's a picture of Richard Nixon and the Soviet First Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev. And basically what happens is the United States pursues a softer version of containment after Vietnam. They pursue this idea of détente, that they are not going to go to war over everything. And the United States and the Soviet Union also begin to negotiate ideas of reducing nuclear weapons. So Nixon and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Basically, these SALT talks are an agreement between the two sides to begin to reduce some of the nuclear weapons. So you can see a cooling of a Cold War as a result of the failure of the Vietnam War for the United States.